Right, so this is AP US History topic 7.13, and this is World War II militarily. So let's take a look. So, first of all, embargo and diplomacy. So, before Pearl Harbor, so before officially entering World War II, the U.S. used diplomacy and economic measures to respond to aggressive expansion by Axis powers. So Japan's invasion of China, which happened in 1937, remember that was Manchuria, and its subsequent occupation of other parts of Asia were seen as a direct threat to global stability and U.S. interest in the Pacific. So the U.S. followed a policy of economic sanctions, cutting off crucial resources like oil, steel, and rubber, and aiming to pressure Japan into halting its territorial expansion. So there were protests over aggressions in China. So Japan's expansion, marked by brutal military campaigns, including the invasion of Manchuria, that Manchuria was 1931, and then the full-scale war in China, which was in 1937. And so these instances, the most famous of them was one that happened in 1937 to 1938, and that was called the Rape of Nanking. And that was a massacre where Japanese forces committed atrocities against Chinese civilians, and they killed an estimated 300,000 people. And so while the U.S. and other nations condemned things like this, there was little direct intervention due to isolation policies and focus on domestic recovery from the Great Depression. Also, there was embargo and negotiations. And so as Japan continued to expand, the U.S. continued to intensify its embargoes. And these are some of the things that we learned about. And this is particularly after Japan occupied French Indochina in 1940 to 1941. So the U.S. froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports, and that was a critical blow as Japan depended on U.S. oil for its military. So diplomatic negotiations continued, but Japan refused to abandon its expansionist goals, and so this economic pressure and failure to reach a diplomatic resolution set the stage for the attack on Pearl Harbor. So that's before Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor, the war begins. So the attack on Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, and the location was Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and that's home to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So some of the details is that Japan launched a surprise attack to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were severely damaged or sunk. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed. The USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma suffered catastrophic damage. And so the aftermath is that the attack shocked and outraged the American public. So Japan had hoped to force the U.S. into peace negotiations, but instead the attack unified the country and led to an immediate declaration of war. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became a rallying cry, inspiring widespread enlistment and mobilization for war. So the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So you can see some of the images here, some of the devastating damage. You can see the smoke here, the fire, and Oahu bombed by Japanese planes, war. And so those are some of the things of the aftermath. Okay, then the United States declares war, and this is the Day of Infamy speech. So on December 8th, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, famously calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The speech emphasized the attack was deliberate and unprovoked, justifying war against Japan. Congress responded by declaring war on Japan almost unanimously. Shortly after, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., bringing America fully into World War II. Okay, so atrocities. As we mentioned earlier, in 1937 to 1938, the Rape of Nanking, over 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were killed, with widespread rape, torture, and destruction. Okay, there was the Pathan Death March in 1942. So, after the fall of the Philippines, tens of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners were forced to march over 60 miles without food, water, or medical care. Thousands died from starvation, exhaustion, or execution by Japanese forces. So, concentration camps. So, these are Nazi concentration camps in the Holocaust. So, the Nazi regime carried out the Holocaust, a systematic genocide targeting 6 million Jews. Millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, Slavic people, and political prisoners, were also killed. So the scale of the Nazi war crimes was fully exposed as Allies forces liberated concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. Okay, next. Women and African Americans. So, women in the military. Women took on essential non combat roles, allowing more men to fight. So, you had the WAC, that's the Women's Army Corps, and the WAVES, the women accepted for voluntary emergency service. So, they served as nurses, pilots, cryptographers, radio operators, and clerks. And so, also, there were minorities in the military. Over 1 million African Americans served, but these were mostly in segregated units. So you had the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African American fighter pilots proving instrumental in aerial battles, and you had the Double V campaign. We talked about this earlier, and it sought victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, laying the groundwork for the civil rights movement. Okay, so there were a lot of conferences that took place between the Allied powers. So the first one in 1943 was the Tehran Conference, and this is the planned the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, and that's D-Day. The Yalta Conference in 1945 discussed post-war Europe and Soviet involvement against Japan, and then the Potsdam Conference issued an ultimatum for Japan's surrender. So the Allies prioritized defeating Germany first, then focusing on Japan. This strategy reflected the immediate threat posed by Nazi Germany. So we have the European theater, North Africa, and Italy. So North Africa campaign, the objective was to secure North Africa to cut Axis supply lines and prepare for the invasion of Europe. So the key battles, and I'm probably going to mess up these names. You don't really have to know that. El Alamein and Operation Torch. So those were both in 1942. And then you had the Italy campaign. So after the Allies captured Sicily, they invaded mainland Italy. And Sicily is an island right here off of Italy. Rome was liberated in June 1944, but fierce German resistance prolonged the campaign. So then you have the European theater, D-Day. So this was on June 6th, 1944. This is the largest amphibious invasion in history, led by U.S., Britain, and Canada. Troops landed on Normandy beaches under heavy German fire, and this marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Excuse me, what I was looking at, this is called Operation Overlord. And so D-Day, very important. Then you have the European theater, victory in Europe. So the Battle of the Bulge happened in December 1944, and this is what you need to know about it is this is Germany's last major counterattack, but is ultimately a failure, and the Allies pushed into Germany, leading to its downfall. That was in December of 1944. And then there was Victory in Europe. This is VE Day, Victory in Europe. This is May 7th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Celebrations erupted across the Allied nations. Okay, the Pacific Theater. All right, so the key battles, the Doolittle Raid. This is in April 1942, a morale-boosting bombing raid on Tokyo. The Battle of Midway, June 1942. This is a turning point where the U.S. destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. And then there's something called the island hopping strategy. So the U.S. captured key islands to cut off Japan's supply lines. And so instead of going to the big places where Japan was well fortified, the U.S. hopped these small little islands to cut off the supply lines for the big places that Japan occupied. So atomic bombs and surrender. The Manhattan Project developed atomic bombs. Oh, island hopping there, atomic bombs and surrender. Sorry, I didn't keep up. So the Manhattan Project developed atomic bombs. I think you can watch Oppenheimer. Probably many of you have watched it. Okay, so Hiroshima, that was a Japanese city, had an atomic bomb dropped on it on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki had an atomic bomb dropped on it. So the devastation forced Japan to surrender, and this was called VJ Day, and it marked Japan's defeat. So there we go. And that is topic 7.13.